Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Auto Riff. This week on the podcast, we will take a brief look at the Oldsmobile Toronado, as well as a new segment called This Week in Automotive History. So sit back, buckle up, and let's start looking into the Oldsmobile Toronado. I'll start off by saying that I don't really have any experience with this car. Can't say that I've ever seen one in person, and really going into this, all I knew was that it was a front-wheel drive car that was built in a time when muscle cars ruled the road, and I think I may have seen it on Jay Leno's garage or something one time, and that probably would spark my my wanting to know about this car. I really wanted to make sure that this episode was less about my stories of driving or being around the car, like the last one with the Power Wagon, where I felt I got a bit too nostalgic and talked less about the history of the actual vehicle. The Toronado name actually started life as a Chevrolet show car, but honestly, I couldn't find anything on that. I couldn't find a picture, couldn't find a blurb, couldn't find anything. And this is kind of where building an audience comes in. It helps me to fill in the gaps, so if you know anything about the Chevrolet Toronado show car that I've found mentioned in a couple articles, please let me know. What I did find out was that the Toronado was designed by David North in 1962 as a design painting as a compact sports car that was never intended for production. And just to pause there, that part kind of struck me, that you have designers essentially designing cars that have no intention of ever seeing the light of day. I work in retail, and I can't imagine having one of my associates do a job that I don't intend to come to fruition. But as I kind of thought about it, allowing designers the creativity to break free of molds and free their minds must be incredibly important to the future design of automobiles. The design was slated to be put on the E-body architecture that was shared with the rear-drive Buick Riviera. David North asked for the design to be put onto the A-body frame, which housed the Chevelle and GTO among others, but was declined for cost reasons. And a quick little sidebar there, for those of you who don't know what I mean when I say E or A-body, General Motors would often have shared platforms among its manufacturers, and for example, the Camaro and Firebird shared the F-body platform, the J-body had the Pontiac Sunfire and Chevy Cavalier, and so on. But when I say E-body or A-body, that's what I mean. It's a shared architecture among the Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet, Pontiac, anyone that was under General Motors at that time. So what interested me about this car was that it was built as a front-wheel drive car, but on a chassis that was shared with a rear-wheel drive car. And what I wanted to know was, why build a front-wheel drive car? I mean, I'm not anti-front-wheel drive, but it would seem to me if you're going to build essentially a sister car that they drive the same wheels, it would be like if you had, for instance, like we just talked about, the Camaro and the Firebird, and the Camaro is rear-wheel drive, but the Firebird is front-wheel drive. I mean, they'd be essentially two completely different cars. The Toronado wasn't the first American front-wheel drive car, but it was the first in about 30 years, following the Cord models 810 and 812, and was among the first, if not the first, to come with an automatic transmission in a front-wheel drive car. What was interesting about the engine was that it was mounted traditionally in the frame like a rear-wheel drive car would be, and not transversely like most modern front-wheel drive cars that we know of, meaning it was mounted front to back and not side to side. And the transmission was mounted on the driver's side of the motor. And as to why they did it, I searched and searched thinking there would be a very specific answer, but the best I could find was that it would reduce costs and it got better fuel economy as well as better traction. Their front-wheel drive system was something that had been worked on since 1958, and they had put 1.5 million test miles into the Toronado before it was released. The first generation of the Toronado lasted from 1966 until 1970, and was powered by what was called the Super Rocket V8, which had 385 torque steering horsepower. And when I say torque steering, if you've ever driven a front-wheel drive car that actually had some power to it, if you let go of the wheel and hit the gas, more often than not, it will pull to one side, and that's torque steer. And it had 475 foot-pounds of torque. It was also awarded the Motor Trend's Car of the Year award in 1966 and Car and Driver's Best Overall Car that same year, which is pretty impressive. I read a couple old archived tests on the Toronado, and most of them were quite good. The only thing I saw was in the first year or two that the brakes were not amazing. I think it had drums, but that was pretty much the extent of it. It rode nicely and everything. The Toronado went into the second generation in 1971 through 1978, featuring the same engine with increasingly less horsepower as government regulations hit it, the same as all the other cars of that time, and was ultimately the demise of the muscle car. The look became more, for lack of a better word, safe, I guess. The almost futuristic spaceship styling was gone, and if you ask me, just looking at it, it kind of looks like a Cadillac at that same time period. In 1979, brought the third generation and was basically a grandpa's car to look at it. It had a 350 cubic inch V8 and also a 307 cubic inch V8, as well as a diesel version made from the 350 cubic inch motor. I have driven a Chevy Blazer with this diesel engine, and it was, what's the word I'm looking for? Terrible? Yes, terrible. That Blazer, as cool as it looked, would get to about 60 miles an hour, and that was it. Uphill, downhill, wind at your back, didn't matter. That was all it had, and that was all you're going to get. The third generation was also the first one with the independent rear suspension that was designed by Cadillac. Finally, the fourth generation looked like a Pontiac Grand Am of that time period, and the sales finally declined so much that it was canceled in 1992, and the last Toronado rolled off the assembly line on May 28th of that year and was replaced by the Oldsmobile Aurora, which I do remember the Aurora. I thought it was a decent car. So that is a brief history of the Oldsmobile Toronado. Honestly, I knew of the first generation, like I said, going into this. I had no idea that it lasted that long. I always had the idea that it lasted a couple years and that was it. So I learned something new from researching this, and I hope you did too. What do you think of the Toronado? I can't help but wonder if it was the start of the wave of front-wheel drive cars to where we are today, with rear drive being hard to find and more for just performance cars. If you have any more Toronado information or stories you'd like to share, please email me at theautoriff@gmail.com or message me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. This podcast will only get better the more listeners share with me. And now on to the segment called This Week in Automotive History. So now on to the new segment called This Week in Automotive History, because it is events that happened in this week in automotive history. It's pretty self-explanatory. So this week being February 22nd through the 28th, we'll get right into it. February 22nd, the Plymouth Superbird got its first NASCAR win at the Daytona 500 in 1970 in a Petty car, but it's not Richard Petty like you might think. It was actually the number 40 car driven by Pete Hamilton, who went on to win 3 more times. I don't know if that was his first. He won 4 times total, 3 times in a Petty car, which I did not know. I thought that was his only win. February 23rd, in 1893, Rudolf Diesel received the patent for, you guessed it, the diesel engine. Also, my personal favorite, the Pontiac Firebird was introduced on this day in 1967. On the 24th, the Hudson Motor Car Company was formed in 1909. Very interesting. On February 25th, in 1837, Thomas Davenport received a patent for the first electric motor. On February 26th, in 1930, the first red and green traffic lights were placed on some street corners in Manhattan. On February 27th, Saab decided to start building cars on this date in 1947. The first model being the 92, which followed an airplane called the 91. And finally, on February 28th, in 1932, on this date, the last Ford Model A was produced. Thank you so much for taking time out of your week to listen to the Auto Riff. I'm not sure yet what car I will be researching next week. I plan on putting a poll on my Instagram page for that soon. If you have any comments, suggestions, or stories you'd like to share, please email me at theautoriff@gmail.com or follow me on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. All sources used for the material will be in the description, as well as links to the show's social media. Thank you for listening again. Everyone drive safe and have a great week.